¿Qué mayor desorden puede haber que el falseamiento de la realidad? Pero cuando te dejan a ti solo para crear tu propio orden, mucha gente se siente completamente sola, desolada, incapaz, angustiada y con el vaído de la falta de sentido, ¿no? Entonces ahí nos movemos en ese filo difícil frente al abismo, ¿no?
And these systems are not our enemy. These systems are not chaos like the devil, you know. These systems, this thing called chaos is actually the sustaining rhythm of life itself.
The most important freedom is the freedom to take apart the social structures that we live in and imagine alternatives and actually create a different kind of social order, is what we call the third freedom.
Este caos interno que puede generar una sinfonía de Mozart, a veces, si está demasiado disparatado, puede generar unas ilusiones, unos delirios.
Entonces no debe de haber ni una sola persona en el mundo que atine con la media estadística en todos sus parámetros. Todos somos divergentes de esa normalidad.
And so, order itself is not a virtue. It all depends on what practices, what laws, what assumptions are embodied in that order.
¿Quiénes somos? ¿Qué es un ser humano? ¿Cómo funciona la mente de un artista? ¿Cómo genera el caos creativo? Es una pregunta muy importante, fundamental.
¿Para qué sirve la vida? ¿Sirve para algo? Para vivir. No sirve para nada más. Mi respuesta es que la vida, lo único que da sentido a la vida es la propia vida. Es decir, somos criaturas hechas para vivir.
And if human beings are the most evolved species, that's really just a reflection of our ability to cooperate and communicate and collaborate with each other.
Democracy today is in trouble. Everybody aspires to democracy. Almost every country wants to claim that it is democratic, but democracy is in peril, and we need to figure out why.
Yo tengo la sensación de que efectivamente en este caos y en esta entropía en la que vivimos también hay un orden de alguna manera, ¿no? Lo más habitual de lo que todo el mundo hace, pero no es cierto en absoluto. La normalidad viene de normativa y es como un marco obligatorio de funcionamiento y de orden personal que inventa cada cultura, cada sociedad, ¿no? En 2018 en la Universidad de Yale en Estados Unidos hicieron un estudio que concluía esto que estoy diciendo, que la normalidad no existe, que lo que llamamos normalidad no es más que la media estadística de todas las posiciones de un ser humano. Y claro, esas medias estadísticas que no existen. Es como cuando te dicen a cada uno nos corresponde hijo y medio, ¿no? Pues absurdo, eso no existe, ¿no? Entonces no debe de haber ni una sola persona en el mundo que atine con la media estadística en todos sus parámetros. Todos somos divergentes de esa normalidad, de ese orden forzoso de cada sociedad. Y lo malo es que eso además crea unas angustias muy grandes individualmente, porque todos somos conscientes de que hay algo divergente que no casa con lo que se supone que es normal. Y desde muy pequeños desarrollamos una serie de estrategias defensivas para que no se nos note que no cabemos dentro de ese molde, ¿no?
So you look at something like the ocean. Nobody understands the ocean. You can't narrow it down and say this wave will come, then that wave will come, and these waves are here and those waves are there. If you use the old style of math, what you do is you put a grid on top of the ocean. Say, this is latitude, that is longitude, you are here. But if you talk to someone surfing in the ocean, they don't care where the latitude line is, where the longitude line is. Someone surfing in the ocean, they're aware of the waves. A surfer, a good surfer knows, no, not this wave, not that wave, but the next wave is going to be the one. So they can feel the rhythm of the ocean itself. So to the map maker, all these waves looks like chaos. To the surfer, all these waves is order, it's music, it's patterns, it's nature. So what we realized in the 1980s and 1990s is that chaos is not random. Chaos is actually the underlying order, the underlying patterns of the universe. And now that we have computers that can do the same kinds of equations that nature does, we can actually begin to understand the underlying patterns. That once you have enough turbulence and motion in a system, you start to get those underlying rhythms. And these are the things that indigenous people understood from the beginning. They don't understand land as territory and the lines of property. They understand the land as regenerative, as living, as a system. And these systems are not our enemy. These systems are not chaos like the devil. You know, these systems, this thing called chaos is actually the sustaining rhythm of life itself.
Cuanto más es estricta, restrictiva, cuanto más dogmática sea esa normalidad, más sufrimiento habrá por parte de la sociedad, ¿no? Entonces eso por parte de un intento completamente fallido de ordenar el caos para los individuos, ¿no? Creo yo. Esa es una reflexión que primero se me ocurre con respecto al caos y al orden individual, ¿no? Que tenemos que plegarnos a un orden que no es real y que nos hace sentirnos anómalos y defectuosos, ¿no? Entonces, la normalidad no existe y la diferencia no es patológica. Eso para mí es una reivindicación esencial. Y en ese regocijo de vivir es el único sentido, ¿no? Pero claro, eso es difícil de aceptar. Entonces emerge mucho más ahora esa inquietud existencial, ¿no? Que por otro lado es interesante de reflexionar sobre ello, porque todos los órdenes forzosos crean un sufrimiento enorme, porque te están mutilando, te están forzando a ser otra cosa. Pero cuando te dejan a ti solo para crear tu propio orden, mucha gente se siente completamente sola, desolada, incapaz, angustiada y con el vaído de la falta de sentido, ¿no? Entonces ahí nos movemos en ese filo difícil frente al abismo, ¿no?
it's possible to rethink our relationship to chaos and to patterns. But in order to do so, we need to feel safe.
Entonces, una pregunta que la especie humana lleva haciéndose toda su historia es ¿quiénes somos? ¿Qué es un ser humano? Es el gran desafío del Renacimiento, ¿no? Del humanismo. El arte, la poesía, la música, la literatura, los filósofos, los psicólogos siempre están intentando entender cuál es la condición humana, cuál es la esencia del ser humano. La esencia del ser humano sale del cerebro y con neurotecnología, los neurobiólogos, vamos a poder entender por dentro qué es un ser humano, por qué nos comportamos como nos comportamos, qué es la mente humana, y será un momento de una iluminación histórica para poder responder a la pregunta ¿qué es un ser humano? ¿Cómo funciona la mente de un artista? ¿Cómo genera el caos creativo? Es una pregunta muy importante, fundamental. Todavía ignoramos cómo ocurre, pero hay teorías que sugieren que el comportamiento del cerebro, de todos los cerebros, tiene un componente estocástico, caótico interno. Las conexiones entre neuronas, estas conexiones de las que hablábamos antes, que son 3 veces más que todo el Internet de la Tierra, cuando activas una neurona, la conexión se puede activar o no. Hay un componente que es como caótico, ¿no? Y es posible que esto sea el germen de la creatividad, que cuando los cerebros de las personas no son una máquina fiel, que aprietas un botón y ocurre una cosa. Aprietas el botón, a veces ocurre una cosa, a veces ocurre otra cosa. Entonces, esto es posible que tenga que ver con los flujos de actividad por el cerebro, que cada vez que ocurren, toman un camino distinto. Y este camino puede ser lo que llamamos creatividad, ¿no? Los artistas quizá tienen un cerebro especialmente creativo, especialmente rico en obtener flujos cerebrales distintos a un estímulo similar, ¿no? Este caos interno que puede generar una sinfonía de Mozart, a veces, si está demasiado disparatado, puede generar unas ilusiones, unos delirios, en un caso de un esquizofrénico, ¿no? Y de hecho hay una constancia que muchos grandes artistas tenían problemas mentales, ¿no?
Right. Art has at least 2 functions. There are 2 ways we evaluate and appreciate art. One is for its own sake, as creative expression that gives us aesthetic pleasure and insight. But another function of art is to prompt rethinking by inviting us to see the world differently. Because what we think about the world doesn't just descend from abstract philosophical ideas. It depends on ways of seeing and apprehending the world. And what art at its best can do is to invite us, sometimes provoke us, to see, to take in the world differently, from a different angle, with a different eye, from a different point of view, displacing our familiar ways of seeing and apprehending the world can prompt us also to question the assumptions associated with conventional ways of seeing and thinking. So art is partly a creative mission project, valuable for its own sake, but it also can be a prompt, a provocation to see the world differently, and therefore sometimes to think differently, to challenge conventional assumptions. Some people think philosophy resides in the heavens, in the clouds, far beyond the world in which we live. I disagree. I think philosophy belongs in the city, where citizens gather and argue and debate and disagree about big questions, such as the meaning of justice and the common good and what we owe one another as fellow citizens.
Y entonces la democracia, que sabe que el ser humano va a intentar eternizarse en el poder y hacerlo absoluto, se dedica a poner dificultades a eso. O sea, la democracia consiste en intentar distribuir lo más posible ese poder, poner cortapisas al poder absoluto. O sea, que es un sistema que se basa en una conciencia pesimista del ser humano, pero funciona, realmente funciona, es lo menos malo, como decían. Las democracias están llenas de problemas, las democracias modernas están en un momento lastimoso de credibilidad social, pero es lo menos malo, sin lugar a dudas. Son las únicas que tienen suficiente transparencia para que podamos ver sus fallos, para que podamos intervenir, para refundarlas, para remozarlas.
Capitalists and libertarians have gotten the idea that human beings are all competing, that nature is a competition. And they quote Darwin, Charles Darwin, and say, oh, you see, Darwin says that nature, the story of life, is the survival of the fittest individual as we compete. But if you actually read the Darwin, that's not what Darwin is saying at all. There's one paragraph where he talks about survival of the fittest in a system. But what Darwin's really writing about is the way that species collaborate and cooperate to ensure mutual survival. And if human beings are the most evolved species, that's really just a reflection of our ability to cooperate and communicate and collaborate with each other.
Well, history, is never just in the past. We're always making history in the present. And the story that I was referring to before, where the rise of civilization also means the rise of inequality, and you have these particular thresholds, the invention of agriculture, the emergence of cities. This story really goes back to what we refer to as the Age of Enlightenment. And it's a story about the origins of inequality. Where does inequality come from? How should we explain the fact that even today, in an era where we have representative democracies in more parts of the world than ever before, we seem to be incapable of escaping from this constant spiral? I mean, the statistics are coming every year, showing that the gap between the rich and the poor, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a tiny number of people around the world, is actually growing larger all the time. So we realized that actually we need to go right back to the origins of the question. Why do we begin thinking this way in the first place, that inequality has an origin? Because actually it already implies a great many things about human history. First of all, it implies that once upon a time there was no inequality. Otherwise, how could it have a beginning, an origin? Where does this notion come from?
Y entonces me parece, por todo eso, por todas esas estructuras que digo, que me parece de lo más ordenado, en realidad, ¿no? Se dan herramientas para que podamos ver sus fallos, sus desórdenes, para que podamos arreglarlas. Me parece al contrario, es casi como... Es un ordenamiento estupendo del juego social. Yo creo que es el mejor ordenamiento del juego social que ha conseguido el ser humano crear hasta ahora. Y es muy eficiente realmente, ¿no? Aunque, insisto, ahora mismo, por ejemplo, la democracia que hay ahora en general en el mundo es muy deficitaria realmente, y hay muchísimo, un cuarto de la población mundial que vive en democracia no se siente representado por esas democracias, y por eso está pasando lo que está pasando. Tendremos que hacer algo, eso es un fallo del sistema democrático, pero está tan bien ordenada en el desorden que podemos hacer algo, que nos permite ver qué problemas son y permite la actuación sobre ellos, y eso es un orden fluido. No hay otro orden que no sea fluido, porque el mundo es así de fluido, de cambiante, de contradictorio, de paradójico. Todo lo que quiera ser un orden cuadrado es una mentira y en el fondo un terrible desorden, porque lo que hace es anular la realidad. ¿Qué mayor desorden puede haber que el falseamiento de la realidad? Pero la idea siempre me ha parecido, por lo menos poéticamente, muy interesante, ¿no? Esa sensación de que en efecto está en eso, esa repetición de los cristales, ¿no? En el mundo, ¿no? Esa especie de orden, de un orden tan ajeno, tan marciano, tan exótico, tan último, ¿no? En las cosas, que nos es muy difícil de comprender, o que nos es muy difícil de ver, pero yo tengo la sensación de que efectivamente en este caos y en esta entropía en la que vivimos también hay un orden de alguna manera, ¿no? Y eso se ve en la ciudad. He dado una vuelta enorme, pero eso se ve en la ciudad, por ejemplo, ¿no? Esa especie de orden orgánico en el caos, ¿no? Es súper interesante. Quizá es una de las cosas que me fascinan de la ciudad. Las grandes ciudades, tal como están organizadas, no conducen al contacto. Entonces, si tú te aferras a ese sentimiento restrictivo de la horda, cuanto más solo personalmente estés. Si tú tienes un montón de amigos, de verdad, amigos con los que sales, a los que ves y tal, no necesitas tanto que esa horda sea tan pequeña. Entonces eso pues viene con la educación de la sociedad y con una vida rica, una vida emocional rica, ¿no? Eso contrarresta esa tendencia a a la construcción de hordas dogmáticas excluyentes, cerradas, ¿no? Montones de hordas. Por ejemplo, cuando me decías hace un momento, no, porque quiero que hables de las mujeres, de los negros, yo decía, hay hordas en donde me dirán, yo no puedo hablar de los negros, ¿no? Porque para eso, porque soy blanca. Pues esa es la cuestión, no se puede llegar a eso, no se puede llegar a eso.
If we do look at nature, we see that the things we were taught in school are not true. I remember when I was in 7th grade, I was 12 years old. Teacher, she told us that the big trees compete with the little trees for sunlight. And the big tree gets the sunlight, and then the little tree dies because it's being shaded by the big tree, and that's evolution. We know that's not true. It turns out the big tree gets the sunlight and then shares its nutrients with the little tree through the soil to the little tree. Then in the winter, when the big tree loses its leaves, the little tree, which is still green, gives its nutrients to the big tree. And they use a network of mycelia in the soil that get a service fee for transacting the energy back and forth. So the forest is not competition between individual trees. The forest is a story of collaboration between those trees. And for human beings to claim that nature is competition and we should all be competing with our businesses to extract as much as we can from the world is not true. That's not nature. That's anti-nature. And it's the reason why it's not a sustainable practice. Well, we're living in a digital media environment, which is different than the media environments that went before. Everything in a digital media environment is like a 1 or a 0. It's what's called a quantized space. So in the real world, a musical note can be anywhere on the spectrum, like ah. In a digital media environment, it's right? It has to be on one of the quantized places. Everything is a click, 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 click. And that changes the way people think. Well, you think if everything has to be 1, 0, yes, no, we end up with the right and the left in politics. You're one or the other. There's no in between. Even with gender and all the different genders we're talking about. Now we have each name. Are you this? Are you that? Are you bi? Are you poly? Are you tri? Are you right? It's like there's no, everything's defined, everything's exact. You have your group, your affinity, your everything becomes precise. Democracy is challenged by the very same order and chaos problem that you're all talking about this year. You know, we use digital technology right now to oversimplify democracy. So digital technology with ones and zeros and the simple binary logic is pushing people towards the right or the left, right? The pro-business or anti-business, pro-environment or anti-environment, pro-life or pro-choice, and everything gets divided. The opportunity with digital technology is actually to have a more complex understanding of democracy. We could start thinking about what's called liquid democracy, where I, as a voter, don't have to understand every issue. But if my friend understands more about the climate and the environment than I do, I can proxy my votes about the environment to her. And my understanding of the food system and policy on agriculture, oh, my friend Joe understands that. I can proxy that vote to him. I have a PhD in economics, so Joe and Mary are going to proxy their vote about taxation to me. And we end up with, we can actually use our expertise. There's ways to use digital technology to make democracy much more elegant. There's ways to use the digital sensibility to move towards things other than simple yes-no votes. We can have ranked choice voting, where you vote for your first choice, second choice, and third choice for president or for senator or something, rather than just one person. And you end up with very different results that reflect the consensus of people, rather than just the winner and the loser. So the possibilities for democracy in a digital age is towards something much more complex. I don't mean complicated, but much more reflective of what people really want, rather than this simple game, these simple contests that we've been using to decide very important matters to the human condition.
One of the most interesting examples, to our minds, actually came from the modern country of Ukraine. Before the Russian invasion, there was a lot of scientific research going on with international teams north of the Black Sea, near the modern city of Uman in central Ukraine, where scientists were discovering the existence of cities which are some of the oldest cities in the world. They're as ancient as the famous old cities of the Middle East, Mesopotamia, Iraq, Syria. So we're talking about really enormous human settlements that go back roughly 6,000 years into the past. And they're buried underneath roughly a meter of soil in central Ukraine. And scientists were able to reconstruct the organization of these cities as something totally different from what we've been told to expect. They found no evidence of temples or palaces or royal burials or central administration and bureaucracy or any of the things that we've always been told were necessary in this kind of Thomas Hobbes story to enable people to actually develop large-scale, sophisticated societies. And in fact, what archaeologists have reconstructed there in Ukraine are settlements which are roughly the size of medieval London, but which seem to have organized themselves from the bottom up on the basis of neighborhoods and self-governing districts. This is really revolutionary in terms of our understanding of scale and what it really meant for human societies to make the transition from small-scale to large-scale forms of organization. So what we're trying to do really is use all of this new evidence to destabilize the foundations of these very deeply entrenched stories, which we conclude are basically myths. They're myths, they're stories that we tell ourselves, which make the current system of global arrangements that we have appear to be somehow natural or inevitable, which is often the function of myths. But we come to the conclusion that really these kinds of stories, which were very radical when they were first invented 300 years ago, 400 years ago, people like Rousseau, they were radicals. They were trying to get people to think outside.
Democracy today is in trouble. Everybody aspires to democracy. Almost every country wants to claim that it is democratic, but democracy is in peril, and we need to figure out why. And I think that a minimal definition of democracy, a very minimal definition, means that when elections are held, those who lose leave. That's the most minimal definition of democracy. But today, even that minimal definition of democracy is in question, as we saw with the January 6th attack on the Capitol in the US and the January 8th attack on the Capitol in Brazil. But it's not enough simply to insist on that minimal standard of democracy, because democracy, going back to ancient Athens, but also in more recent times and aspiration, democracy is really about governing ourselves, but governing ourselves through public discussion, through debate, through reasoning together. And we're not born with the capacity to reason well across our differences. This is something that has to be learned and cultivated. It requires the cultivation of civic virtues. It requires an orientation to the common good. It requires the ability of citizens, whatever their social and economic background, to listen to one another, to argue and disagree with civility and mutual respect. These are among the civic virtues that genuine democracy requires. And today, one of the reasons democracy is in trouble is that we've lost the ability to listen not only to the words of those with whom we disagree, but also to listen for the moral convictions and the principles that lie behind our disagreements. This is an art, the art of listening. It's a civic virtue, and we have to find ways to cultivate it if democracy is to survive and to flourish.
Cada vez se permite más que el desorden y las diversas visiones de la vida emerjan, ¿no? Que eso es bueno. Pero por otro lado, esa falta de contención del caos, pues mucha gente le asusta. Y como además es un mundo que realmente estamos con unos problemas gravísimos, que ahora mismo nos afectan, ¿no? Es decir, problemas enormes que no podemos controlar y que asustan mucho, como por ejemplo el calentamiento climático, que realmente es gravísimo, ¿no? Pues entonces todo eso hace que nos sintamos cada vez más pequeños, más solos, y eso está fomentando, por un lado, algo bueno, que es la emergencia de las diversas formas del ser, de las diversas necesidades personales, de las diversas tradiciones, de las diversas verdades. Eso es bueno. Pero por otro lado, yo creo que está fomentando como un deseo o una ansia de crear tu propia horda, y una horda cerradísima, y hacerte dueño o dueña de esa horda, ¿no? Porque eso te reafirma y te protege, y eso es malo.
So we see people who are realizing this but don't know what to do about it are becoming part of some very dangerous movements that look like populist movements, but they're really just people who are angry that the institutions that are supposed to be helping us are no longer doing that. If we don't retrieve the functions of these institutions and learn to exercise them in new ways, then I fear for the stability of our society, because people are coming to see civilization itself as the enemy to their own sustainability, rather than as the way that we orchestrate human survival together.
Citizens want public life to be about big questions, including questions of values. What is a just society? What's the meaning of the common good? What do we owe one another as fellow citizens?
In my opinion, it has a great deal to do with the way we understand the concept of freedom. And the way that the concept of freedom has kind of transitioned, I think, really within our lifetimes, let's say since the 1960s, when freedom was very much a left-wing idea, has really transitioned into a right-wing idea, where what freedom is supposed to mean is really all about the individual. It became very obvious, I think, globally during the COVID pandemic, that being free to a great many people was really a form of power. I refuse to wear a mask. I will exert my freedom, my ownership of my own person, my individual power, which is a certain way of understanding freedom as something that you exercise to the cost of other people. And I think what we've lost sight of, and what is very much bound up with these new questions that we're trying to explore in our work, is the idea of freedom as a social value. In other words, not freedom as a form of individual power, but the idea of forms of human freedom which enable the freedom of others, which is a way of thinking about freedom that is actually quite common in non-Western philosophies, but is somehow very little developed in the Western tradition, or what you might call the Enlightenment tradition, where ideas about freedom are very much bound up with ideas about slavery and property and ownership.
But today, our public discourse is largely empty of those big questions. I think that's one of the reasons there's so much frustration today with public discourse. And we see this in democracies throughout the world. I also worry about this. If we create a kind of moral void, a morally empty public space for fear of disagreement, sooner or later, that moral void, that moral vacuum, that empty space will be filled by narrow, harsh, intolerant moralisms and ideology, typically fundamentalist ideologies or hyper-nationalist, authoritarian ideologies. We've seen this happen. We've seen this happen recently. I myself would be wary, would be suspicious of thoroughgoing chaos on the one hand, or an uncritically accepted order on the other. I think democracy works, civic life at its best, depends on rejecting either sheer chaos or the unquestioned authority that goes with a certain kind of order. The virtue that chaos suggests is a willingness to challenge and maybe to rethink and overturn conventional wisdom and established assumptions and mainstream opinions. Now that's not chaos exactly. I would describe it as questioning, as challenging, and maybe disrupting the settled assumptions of a political order that may be unjust. As for order, if an order becomes frozen in place, where people can't question the assumptions underlying that order, typically such unquestioned forms of order in politics conceal or repress injustices. And so order itself is not a virtue. It all depends on what practices, what laws, what assumptions are embodied in that order. So I suppose as between chaos and order, I think the way we navigate ourselves between these two unsatisfactory conditions is to seek a kind of open, pluralistic, contestable kind of politics that does not descend into a kind of meaningless or nihilistic chaos, because we need meaning to give direction to our lives individually and collectively, but that neither embraces order for its own sake without allowing for the possibility of questioning and challenging and rethinking the laws and assumptions on which the city depends, which brings us back to Socrates and the mission of philosophy. Socrates did not give lectures. He was not a university professor. He didn't write books. He wandered the streets of Athens and asked questions.
El ser humano es una narración. Somos palabras, fundamentalmente. Somos una narración que intenta poner orden en el vacío, claro. Una narración siempre, un relato, siempre ordena. Eso es una de las cosas que nos gustan de las novelas. Incluso la novela más experimental tiene un principio y un final, aunque no sea argumental, pero físicamente la abres y empieza y se acaban las páginas y termina, ¿no? O sea que hay un orden inevitable en una narración. Y nos vamos narrando y cambiando además ese relato. O sea que si tú cambias, lo decía el filósofo estoico Epicteto, ¿no? Lo que le afecta al ser humano no es lo que le sucede, es lo que se cuenta de lo que le sucede. Y es así, tú cambias el relato de tu vida y cambias literalmente tu vida, aunque lo que te haya sucedido sea exactamente igual, al colocarlo de otra manera cambias tu vida.
I would distinguish between optimism and hope. It's not easy to be optimistic today because of all of the pressures of polarization and social media that reinforce the polarization. It's not easy to be optimistic, but I do have hope. I am hopeful.
En esa pequeña elección nos jugamos la vida, porque es la manera en la que vamos a contar, a construir, de hecho, narrativamente, pero realmente nuestra historia, ¿no? Es decir, para considerar que de algún modo tu vida ha tenido un sentido. Dentro de este caos absoluto que es la existencia, te puedes inventar un sentido para tu vida, ¿no?